At 6 p.m. on the evening of December 16th, 1773, a crowd gathered at the Old South Meeting House in Boston, Massachusetts. It was a cold Thursday night in the dying light of autumn. Nearly 7,000 people were packed into the building and spilled out into the surrounding streets. They were waiting for word from the governor. The men inside had been deliberating all day. They had sent a final petition to Governor Thomas Hutchinson, demanding that 3 ships anchored at Griffin's Wharf be allowed to leave the harbor with their cargo still on board. The cargo was tea. Several hundred chests of it, consigned to the East India Company under the Tea Act passed earlier that year. The governor had refused to let the ships depart without paying the duty. He was not in Boston that day. He was at his country house in Milton, 4 miles away. The crowd waited. At about 5:45 p.m., a messenger arrived at the Old South Meeting House. The governor's answer was no. The ships would not be allowed to leave. The tea would have to be landed and the tax paid. Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the resistance, stood and said, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It was not an order, it was a signal. Within minutes, men began moving toward the wharf. What happened? The 3 ships tied up at Griffin's Wharf were the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. They had arrived in Boston between late November and early December, carrying more than 300 chests of tea, roughly 90,000 pounds. Under British law, once a ship entered the harbor, it had 20 days to unload its cargo and pay the customs duties. If the duty was not paid, the cargo could be seized by customs officials and the ship confiscated. The deadline for the Dartmouth was December 17th, the following day. The colonists had been trying to force the ships to leave before that deadline without paying the tax. Governor Hutchinson, acting on instructions from London, had refused to issue clearance papers. The ships were trapped. The crowd at the meeting house knew that if the tea came ashore, the principle of parliamentary taxation would be accepted by default. That principle, no taxation without representation, was the core of the colonial grievance. The Tea Act had lowered the tax on tea but gave the East India Company a monopoly on its sale in the colonies. The tax itself was small, 3 pence per pound, but the colonists saw it as a direct violation of their rights. They had already boycotted British tea. They had forced consignees, the merchants appointed to receive the tea, to resign. But the ships remained. How did the situation reach this point? The story of the Boston Tea Party begins years earlier, not on a wharf in December, but in the chambers of Parliament in London. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, Great Britain was left with a massive national debt. The British government, led by King George III and Prime Minister George Grenville, decided that the American colonies should help pay for their own defense. Over the next decade, Parliament passed a series of revenue acts: the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and the Townshend Acts of 1767. Each time, the colonies protested. They argued that they had no elected representatives in Parliament, and therefore Parliament had no right to tax them. The Stamp Act was repealed after widespread boycotts and violence, but Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, affirming its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The Townshend Acts imposed duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Again, the colonies resisted. In Boston, a mob attacked customs officials, and British troops were sent to restore order. On March 5, 1770, a confrontation between soldiers and a crowd turned deadly. 5 colonists were killed. It became known as the Boston Massacre. Shortly after, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, but it kept the tax on tea. The tax was a symbol. It was Parliament's way of insisting on its authority. For 3 years, the tea tax remained an irritant but not a crisis. Many colonists simply bought smuggled Dutch tea, which was cheaper anyway. Then in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. The act was not designed to raise revenue. It was designed to rescue the financially struggling East India Company, one of the most powerful corporations in the British Empire. The company had millions of pounds of tea sitting in London warehouses that it could not sell. Under the Tea Act, the company was allowed to ship tea directly to the colonies, bypassing British merchants and selling through its own consignees. The duty was still 3 pence per pound, but because the company was exempt from other taxes in England, its tea would be cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea. The colonists saw the trap. If they accepted the tea, they accepted the precedent of parliamentary taxation. If they refused to buy it, the tea would sit in customs warehouses, be seized for non-payment of duty, and sold at auction, again legitimizing the tax. The only way to preserve their principle was to prevent the tea from landing at all. In the fall of 1773, 7 ships carrying East India Company tea set sail for the colonies. 4 were bound for other ports: Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston. In Philadelphia and New York, the consignees were forced to resign, and the ships simply turned back to England. In Charleston, the tea was landed but left to rot in a warehouse. Boston was different. The consignees there included 2 of Governor Hutchinson's sons. They refused to resign. Hutchinson himself was determined to enforce the law. The 3 ships entered Boston Harbor and were moored at Griffin's Wharf. The colonists organized mass meetings. They formed a group called the Sons of Liberty. They posted guards at the wharf to prevent the tea from being unloaded. They demanded that the ships leave. Hutchinson refused. The 20-day deadline approached. On the night of December 16th, the people of Boston made their decision. The men who moved toward the wharf that night were not a mob of criminals. They were ordinary colonists, artisans, shopkeepers, farmers, sailors. Some were members of the Sons of Liberty. Many had been involved in the earlier resistance. They had planned the operation in advance. They had organized themselves into 3 groups, 1 for each ship. They had disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, smearing their faces with soot and wearing blankets over their clothes. The disguise served 2 purposes. It concealed their identities from British authorities, and it symbolized their rejection of British civilization in favor of what they considered an authentic American identity. They were also careful to destroy only the tea. No other cargo was damaged. No locks were broken. No property was stolen. One participant later recalled that they opened the chests carefully and emptied the tea into the water, taking care not to waste a leaf that could be used for personal consumption. They worked quickly. The moon was low. The tide was out. The harbor was cold and black. For 3 hours they hauled chests from the holds of the ships, split them open with axes, and poured the tea into the water. By 9 p.m., more than 45 tons of tea, worth roughly $1 million in today's currency, had been destroyed. When they finished, they dispersed into the night. The street cleaners swept up stray leaves. No one was arrested. No one was identified. The Boston Tea Party was over. But the consequences had only begun. The British government reacted with fury. King George III wrote that the colonies must either submit or triumph. Parliament passed a series of punitive measures that colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Charter was amended, stripping the colony of its right to elect its own council and allowing the royal governor to appoint judges and sheriffs. British officials accused of crimes in the colonies would be tried in England. A new quartering act allowed British troops to be billeted in private homes. The acts were intended to isolate Massachusetts and force the colonies to back down. Instead, they united them. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September once events for. Committees of correspondence spread news of British oppression. Militias began drilling. Stockpiles of weapons and gunpowder were gathered. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched to Concord to seize colonial military supplies. At Lexington, shots were fired. The American Revolution had begun. What systems failed? The British system of imperial governance failed in its understanding of colonial resistance. The Tea Act was a well-intentioned economic measure that ignored the political significance of the tax. Parliament assumed that the colonies would accept cheaper tea and let the principle slide. They misjudged the depth of colonial opposition. The colonial system of petition and negotiation also failed. Governor Hutchinson could have allowed the ships to leave. He chose not to. The consignees could have resigned. They chose not to. The colonists had exhausted legal means of protest. Direct action was the only remaining option. The failure was not in any single decision, but in the rigid refusal to compromise on both sides. The British saw the Tea Party as an act of illegal destruction. The colonists saw it as a defense of their rights. Neither side could back down without losing face. That rigid dynamic led to war. Why does the Boston Tea Party still matter? It matters because it represents one of the first large-scale acts of civil disobedience in American history. It was a deliberate, organized, nonviolent protest against an unjust law. The participants acted not out of lawlessness, but out of principle. They were willing to accept the consequences of their actions. John Adams, who later became the second president, wrote that the destruction of the tea was so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have such important and lasting consequences that he could not help considering it as an epoch in history. He was right. The Tea Party became a symbol of resistance to tyranny. It inspired later movements for independence, civil rights, and social justice. It also raises uncomfortable questions about the limits of protest. When does civil disobedience become law-breaking? When does defiance of authority become legitimate? These questions remain relevant in every democracy. The Boston Tea Party did not answer them. It simply forced them into the open. The men who dumped the tea into Boston Harbor that night were not trying to start a revolution. They were trying to protect a principle. They did not know that their actions would lead to war, independence, and the creation of a new nation. They only knew that they could not stand by while their rights were taken away. The tea settled to the bottom of the harbor, mixing with mud and silt. It has never been recovered. But the idea that a small group of citizens could stand up to the most powerful empire on earth and change the course of history remains as powerful as ever. The Boston Tea Party was not the end of a story. It was the beginning. At 10 p.m. on the 16th of December 1773, the last chest of East India Company tea broke open against the railing of the Dartmouth. The contents poured into Boston Harbor, joining more than 300 other chests already sinking in the cold salt water. The men in Mohawk disguise had finished their work. They swept the decks clean of loose leaves and stepped back onto Griffin's Wharf. The moon was setting. The tide was ebbing. The tea drifted with the current, spreading in a dark stain that slowly dispersed into the Atlantic. By midnight, the harbor was quiet. The ships sat empty. The British customs officials, watching from their windows, did nothing. What happened next was not a single event, but a chain of consequences that unspooled over the following months. The first signal came on the morning of December 17th. Governor Thomas Hutchinson was woken by a messenger who informed him of the destruction. Hutchinson had spent the previous weeks resisting all demands to let the ships leave. He believed that by holding firm, he could force the colonists to accept the tea and submit to parliamentary authority. He had miscalculated. Now he wrote a frantic dispatch to London, describing the night's events in terms that would inflame the British government. He called it an act of treason, a violent outrage, a direct challenge to the sovereignty of Parliament. The letter traveled by packet ship, taking about 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. It arrived in London in late January once events eventful. On the same day, the Sons of Liberty published their own account. They claimed that the destruction had been necessary to preserve the liberties of the colonies. They had tried every legal avenue. They had petitioned the governor. They had asked the consignees to resign. They had offered to pay for the tea if the ships were allowed to depart. Hutchinson had refused. The people had no choice. The language was careful and deliberate. The authors knew that their words would be used to justify or condemn the action. They wanted the record to show that the Tea Party was not a riot but a measured act of political resistance. The British government did not see it that way. On January 29, 1774, Prime Minister Lord North received word of the Tea Party. He called an emergency session of Parliament. The debate that followed lasted for weeks. North argued that the colonies must be punished swiftly and severely. If Boston could destroy property with impunity, the entire empire would unravel. The opposition, led by figures like Edmund Burke, urged caution. They pointed out that the Tea Act had provoked the crisis and that the colonists had a legitimate grievance. But the mood in Parliament was for retaliation. King George III himself wrote that the colonies must either submit or triumph. He pressed North to act. On March 7, 1774, Parliament introduced the first of 4 punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts, or as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston to all commerce until the East India Company was compensated for the destroyed tea. The act took effect on June 1, 1774. Ships could not enter or leave the harbor. Fishing boats were forbidden. Supplies of food and fuel were cut off. Boston became a city under siege. The act was designed to starve the colonists into submission, but the surrounding towns and the other colonies refused to abandon Boston. They sent food, money, and volunteers. The act backfired. It turned Boston into a symbol of martyrdom. The Massachusetts Government Act followed on May 20, 1774. It fundamentally altered the colony's charter. The elected council was replaced with appointees chosen by the royal governor. Town meetings, the cornerstone of New England democracy, were banned except for the election of local officials. Judges and sheriffs were placed under the governor's control. The act stripped Massachusetts of the self-government it had enjoyed for over a century. The colonists saw it as an attack on their fundamental rights. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in England or elsewhere in the empire. This meant that a soldier who killed a colonist could be sent to London for trial, where he would likely be acquitted. The act effectively gave British authorities immunity from prosecution. The colonists called it the Murder Act. Finally, the Quartering Act of 1774 expanded the conditions under which British troops could be housed in private homes. Previous laws had required barracks or inns. Now troops could be billeted in any unoccupied building, and colonial authorities were required to provide them with supplies. The act was intended to ensure that the British Army could be stationed in Boston without cost to the Crown. Parliament passed all 4 acts with large majorities. King George III gave his assent on June 2, 1774. General Thomas Gage, the commander of British forces in North America, was appointed governor of Massachusetts. He was given broad powers to enforce the new laws. Gage arrived in Boston on May 17, 1774, even before the acts took effect. He found a city simmering with anger. The port was still open for a few more weeks, but everyone knew what was coming. On June 1st, the Boston Port Act came into force. The harbor fell silent. Ships were unloaded and left to rot at anchor. Merchants lost their livelihoods. Sailors had no work. The poor, who depended on trade for their survival, faced starvation. The British Navy patrolled the harbor entrance, turning away any vessel that tried to enter. The city's economy collapsed within weeks. But the coercive acts united the colonies in a way that no previous British measure had done. Committees of correspondence in Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, and the other colonies began exchanging letters. They condemned the acts as a threat to all American liberties. If Massachusetts could be stripped of its charter, any colony could be next. The call went out for a Continental Congress. On September 5, 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. Georgia did not send representatives, but it would join later. The First Continental Congress was a remarkable assembly. It included George Washington, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, John Jay, and many other men who would become the leaders of the Revolution. They did not come to declare independence. They came to coordinate a response to the British crackdown. The Congress debated for 7 weeks. Some delegates argued for conciliation. Others demanded immediate resistance. They compromised on a set of resolutions that included a declaration of colonial rights, an endorsement of Massachusetts's resistance, and a call for a boycott of British goods. They also agreed to meet again in May 1775 if their demands were not met. They sent a petition to King George III asking for repeal of the coercive acts. The king refused to receive it. While the Congress debated, Massachusetts prepared for war. The Colonial Assembly, now meeting illegally outside Boston, created a committee of safety and a committee of supplies. They began stockpiling weapons, gunpowder, and provisions. They ordered the militia to be reorganized and drilled. Minutemen, special companies ready to fight at a minute's notice, were formed across the colony. The British authorities knew about these preparations. General Gage sent spies into the countryside. He learned that the colonists had hidden military supplies in Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. On April 18, 1775, Gage ordered a force of 700 British regulars to march to Concord and seize the supplies. The expedition was supposed to be secret, but the colonists had their own intelligence network. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out to warn the militia. Lanterns were hung in the steeple of the Old North Church, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. The British were coming by boat across the Charles River. At about 5 a.m. on April 19th, the British advance guard reached the town of Lexington. They found about 70 Minutemen lined up on the village green. No one knows who fired the first shot, but once it was fired, the British opened fire. 8 colonists were killed, 10 wounded. The American Revolution had begun. The British continued to Concord. They destroyed some supplies, but most had been moved or hidden. As they began their march back to Boston, colonial militia gathered from the surrounding towns. They fired from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings. The British column was under constant attack. By the time they reached Boston, they had lost 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The colonists had lost 49 dead, 41 wounded. The war was now unavoidable. What systems failed in the months after the Boston Tea Party? The British system of colonial administration failed to recognize the depth of colonial unity. The coercive acts were designed to isolate Massachusetts, but instead they created a common cause among all the colonies. The British intelligence system failed to predict the speed and scale of colonial military mobilization. General Gage underestimated the ability of the militia to fight effectively. The command system failed to adapt. Gage had clear instructions to enforce the acts, but he did not have enough troops to control the countryside. Once the fighting started, the conflict escalated beyond any single decision. The human consequences were immediate and lasting. Families in Boston were displaced as the port closed. Many colonists fled the city to seek refuge in the countryside. British soldiers were quartered in homes, creating daily friction. The economy of Massachusetts was shattered. Trade routes were cut off. Inflation began. The price of food and basic goods soared. The poor suffered most. But the spirit of resistance did not break. The Boston Tea Party had set a precedent. Ordinary citizens had taken direct action against an unjust law. They had faced the power of the British Empire and not backed down. That example spread across the colonies. Why does the Boston Tea Party still matter today? It matters because it is a story about ordinary people making an extraordinary choice. They did not have to destroy the tea. They could have accepted it, paid the tax, and moved on. But they understood that the principle was more important than the convenience. They chose to risk imprisonment, financial ruin, and even death to defend what they believed was right. That willingness to act on principle is the foundation of democratic citizenship. The Tea Party also raises a question that has no easy answer. When is civil disobedience justified? The colonists were breaking the law. They destroyed private property. They defied the authority of a legitimate government. But they did so in response to a law they believed was fundamentally unjust. That tension between law and justice is as old as politics itself. The Boston Tea Party does not resolve it. It simply shows what can happen when people decide that the law is not the final word. The men who dressed as Mohawks and dumped the tea into the harbor did not know they were making history. They only knew they could not remain silent. The tea settled into the mud at the bottom of Boston Harbor. Over the centuries, it has become part of the sediment, indistinguishable from the silt. But the idea that a small group of determined citizens can change the course of an empire has never settled. It remains alive, waiting for the next moment when the principle demands action. The Boston Tea Party was not the end of a story. It was the beginning. And the beginning, as we have seen, led to war, independence, and a nation that still wrestles with those same questions today. At 10 a.m. on December 17, 1773, The morning after the Boston Tea Party, the harbor surface was still streaked with tea leaves. The tide had carried some of the chests out toward the islands, but much of the tea had settled into the mud along the wharves. Boats rowed out to salvage what they could. A few chests were recovered intact. Others had broken open on the rocks. The smell of tea hung over the water for days. In the days that followed, Boston's town meeting convened. The participants of the Tea Party were known to many, but they were not publicly named. Samuel Adams and John Hancock had not boarded the ships, but they had orchestrated the resistance. The question now was what would happen next. The British authorities demanded that the perpetrators be brought to justice. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who had been replaced by General Gage but still held power until the changeover, issued a proclamation. He offered a reward of £100 for information leading to the arrest of any person involved in the destruction of the tea. No one came forward. The city closed ranks. On December 21st, the Dartmouth and the Aliner joined the Beaver back at Griffin's Wharf. Their captains and owners faced ruin. The tea that had been dumped was not insured for the loss. The East India Company estimated the value at about £9,000 sterling, a substantial sum in 1/7/3. The company applied to the British government for compensation. The Crown, in turn, expected the colony to pay, but the colony had no intention of paying. The tea was destroyed by citizens acting outside the law, and the colonial government refused to prosecute them. A standoff had begun. On January 7, 1774, a ship carrying news of the Tea Party arrived in London. The voyage took about 3 weeks in winter weather. The reports were read aloud in Parliament on January 22nd. The reaction was immediate and severe. Lord North, the Prime Minister, declared that the colonies must be brought to submission. He argued that the destruction of the tea was an act of rebellion, not a simple protest. The East India Company's directors lobbied for strong action. They had lost the tea and the expected revenue. They wanted the perpetrators punished and the losses recovered. Parliament debated for weeks. The old arguments about the right to tax and the right to representation were revived. But there was no patience for compromise. The king himself supported harsh measures. On March 7th, Lord North introduced a bill that would close the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. The Boston Port Act passed the House of Commons with large majorities. It was rushed through the House of Lords and received royal assent on March 31st. The act was to take effect on June 1st, 1774. But that was not the only measure. Parliament passed 3 more acts that spring. The Massachusetts Government Act altered the colony's charter, stripping the elected assembly of much of its power. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the governor to move trials of British officials to other colonies or to Britain, effectively shielding them from local juries. The Quartering Act required colonists to provide housing and supplies for British soldiers. These 4 acts became known in America as the Intolerable Acts. In Britain, they were called the Coercive Acts. The British government believed these acts would isolate Massachusetts and force it to submit. They miscalculated. The coercive acts had the opposite effect. News of the Boston Port Act reached America in early May. Committees of correspondence in every colony sprang into action. They drafted resolutions of support for Boston. They called for a boycott of British goods. They proposed a Continental Congress to coordinate a united response. The speed of communication was remarkable for the era. Letters traveled by horseback and ship, but the network of committees was efficient. Within 6 weeks, the idea of a Continental Congress had been accepted by most colonies. What happened when the Boston Port Act took effect on June 1st? The harbor fell silent. The British Navy sealed the entrance. No ships could enter or leave without permission. The city's economy, already strained by years of non-importation agreements, collapsed. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. Merchants went bankrupt. The poor faced starvation. In response, the other colonies sent food and money. Relief shipments arrived from as far away as South Carolina. The city of Marblehead offered the use of its harbor for unloading. Salem offered space for trade. Boston did not stand alone. The Massachusetts Government Act went into effect on August 1st. It abolished the elected council and replaced it with a body appointed by the governor. Town meetings were restricted. The governor was given sole power to appoint judges, sheriffs, and other officials. The colonial assembly, which had already been meeting illegally outside Boston, was effectively dissolved. In response, the colonists simply ignored the new charter. They continued to hold town meetings despite the ban. They formed a provincial congress that functioned as an alternative government. The British had no effective way to stop them without a massive military presence. General Thomas Gage arrived in Boston on May 17, 1774, before some of the acts had even taken effect. He was the military governor, and he brought with him additional troops. By August, there were about 4,000 British soldiers in Boston. The city's population was then about 15,000. The soldiers were quartered in public buildings, in tents on the common, and in private homes under the Quartering Act. The presence of armed troops created constant tension. Fistfights and brawls broke out between soldiers and colonists. The memory of the Boston Massacre in 1770 was still fresh. Everyone knew that a single spark could ignite violence. The British command structure had a fundamental flaw. Gage had orders to enforce the coercive acts, but he did not have enough troops to occupy the entire colony. He controlled Boston and a few coastal fortifications. The countryside was under colonial control. The militia in Massachusetts had been reorganized and trained. Weapons and gunpowder were being stockpiled in Concord, Worcester, and other towns. Gage knew about these preparations. He sent spies to gather intelligence. But he underestimated the speed and coordination of the colonial response. On September 1st, 1774, a detachment of British soldiers marched from Boston to Cambridge and seized 250 barrels of gunpowder stored in the powder house. The colonists reacted with alarm. Thousands of militia mobilized and marched toward Boston. They believed the British were beginning a campaign to disarm them. The rumor spread that blood had been shed. It turned out to be a false alarm, but the demonstration of force was not lost on Gage. He realized that the militia could mobilize quickly and in large numbers. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia from September 5 to October 26, 1774. 12 colonies sent delegates. They included George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Jay, and others who would become leaders of the Revolution. The Congress debated the proper response to the coercive acts. Some delegates wanted to go to war immediately. Others wanted to petition the king for redress. They compromised. They adopted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which asserted the colonists' right to life, liberty, and property, and condemned the coercive acts as unconstitutional. They also formed the Continental Association, which called for a boycott of British goods starting on December 1, 1774. They agreed to meet again in May 1775 if their grievances were not addressed. They sent a petition to King George III. The king refused to receive it. In his speech to Parliament on November 18, 1774, he declared that the colonies were in a state of rebellion. He ordered that additional troops be sent to America. He gave Gage instructions to take decisive action. The British government believed that a show of force would crush the rebellion before it spread. They were wrong. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage ordered a force of about 700 British regulars to march to Concord and seize the military supplies stored there. The mission was not a secret. Colonial sympathizers in Boston observed the troop movements. Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out to warn the countryside. There was no doubt about the outcome. At dawn on April 19th, the British advance guard reached Lexington. They found a small group of militia on the green. Someone fired. The British returned fire. 8 colonials were killed. The British then marched to Concord, where they destroyed some supplies, but most had been moved. On the return march, the British column was ambushed by militia firing from behind walls and trees. The retreat became a running battle. By the time the British reached Boston, they had suffered 273 casualties. The colonists had lost 93. The war had begun. What systems failed in the months after the Boston Tea Party? The British intelligence system failed to anticipate the colonial response. Gage had agents in the countryside, but he did not understand the depth of colonial unity. He believed that the majority of colonists were loyal to the crown, and that only a small faction was fomenting rebellion. He was incorrect. The colonial committees of correspondence had built an effective communication network that the British could not penetrate. The British command system failed to adapt to the realities of colonial terrain and guerrilla tactics. The soldiers were trained for European warfare, not for fighting in woods and fields against an invisible enemy. The British supply system failed to support an army operating far from its bases. The soldiers faced shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The British political system failed to recognize the legitimacy of colonial grievances. Lord North and King George III treated the protests as criminal insurrection rather than as a political crisis that required negotiation. The result was a war that neither side fully wanted, but that both sides believed they had to fight. The human consequences were devastating. Thousands of colonists died in the 8 years of war that followed. Tens of thousands were wounded. Civilians lost their homes, their farms, and their lives. The British also suffered casualties and financial losses. The economy of the American colonies was disrupted for years. Trade patterns shifted. Debts accumulated. But out of the war came a new nation, founded on principles of self-government and individual liberty. The Boston Tea Party was not the cause of the war, but it was the moment when the conflict became unavoidable. It was the line that the colonists drew and the British crossed. Why does the Boston Tea Party still matter? It matters because it shows that ordinary citizens can change the course of history. The men who dumped the tea were not politicians or generals. They were sailors, artisans, laborers, and shopkeepers. They risked their freedom and their livelihoods. They broke the law. But they believed they were acting in a just cause. That example has inspired countless movements for social and political change around the world. The Tea Party is a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, even when the stakes are high and the outcome uncertain. It also raises difficult questions. The tea was private property. The colonists destroyed it without compensation. Was that justified? The British government was a legitimate authority. The colonists defied it. Were they right to do so? The answers depend on where you stand. The Boston Tea Party does not provide easy answers. It provides a story of people who faced a choice between obedience and resistance, and who chose to resist. That story endures because the question of when to resist remains as relevant today as it was in 1773. The tea at the bottom of Boston Harbor is long gone, but the principle that citizens have a right and a duty to oppose unjust laws remains alive. The Boston Tea Party was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a conversation that continues every time people stand up and say, "This is not right." At approximately 3 p.m. on June 17, 1775, a line of British regulars began marching up the slope of Breed's Hill in Charlestown, Massachusetts. The day had started with naval bombardment. British warships in Boston Harbor hurled cannonballs and exploding shells at the peninsula. The colonial militia had worked through the night to construct a redoubt on the hill, a hastily built earthen fortification. By morning, about 1,500 colonists were in position. They were low on ammunition. Their commander, Colonel William Prescott, gave the famous order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The British commander, General William Howe, had planned a frontal assault. He believed the colonial militia would break and run after the first volley. He was wrong. The redcoats advanced in disciplined ranks, carrying heavy muskets and full packs. The heat was oppressive. The grass on the slope was dry. The colonists waited inside the redoubt and behind a rail fence on the left flank. When the British were within 50 yards, the colonial line erupted in a volley. The front rank of the British force was shredded. Men fell by the dozens. The survivors hesitated, then retreated. Howe reformed his troops and ordered a second assault. Again, the colonists held their fire until the last moment. Again, the British were repulsed with heavy losses. By this time, the colonists were almost out of powder. The third assault came at around 4 p.m. This time, the British marched with bayonets fixed. The colonial fire was sporadic. The redoubt was stormed. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted. The colonists, out of ammunition, used their muskets as clubs. They retreated when the redoubt was overrun. The British pursued, but the colonial rear guard covered the withdrawal. The battle ended with the British in control of the peninsula, but the cost was staggering. British casualties totaled 1,054 killed and wounded. The dead included 19 officers. The colonists lost about 450 killed and wounded. Among the dead was Dr. Joseph Warren, a prominent Patriot leader who had served as a major general but fought as a volunteer. The British held the ground, but the victory was hollow. General Howe later said that the outcome gave him a very serious lesson. If the militia had held its fire even a little longer, the battle might have ended with a British disaster. Instead, it ended with a British Pyrrhic victory that convinced the colonists they could stand against regular troops. What happened in the months that followed? The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be called, transformed the conflict. The Second Continental Congress, already meeting in Philadelphia, had been debating whether to seek reconciliation or prepare for war. News of the battle tipped the balance. On July 14, 1775, Congress appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. He left Philadelphia and arrived in Cambridge on July 18 to take command of the colonial forces besieging Boston. The siege of Boston began immediately after Lexington and Concord. The colonial militia had surrounded the city, cutting off land access. The British controlled the harbor, but the colonial forces controlled the countryside. The siege lasted nearly 11 months. Both sides settled into a tense stalemate. The British troops inside Boston faced shortages of fresh food and firewood. Disease spread. The colonial army, numbering about 14,000 men, lacked artillery, gunpowder, and proper training. But in November 1775, a young bookstore clerk named Henry Knox proposed a daring plan. He would travel to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, where the colonists had captured a large cache of British artillery in May 1775. He would then transport the cannons over 300 miles of snow-covered roads, mountains, and rivers to the colonial lines outside Boston. Washington approved the plan. Knox left for Ticonderoga on November 17th. He found about 60 cannons, mortars, and howitzers. He loaded them onto boats, crossed Lake George, and then transferred them onto sledges. The weather was brutal. Deep snow, freezing temperatures, and treacherous terrain slowed the column. Men and oxen struggled to drag the heavy guns. At one point, a cannon broke through the ice of a frozen river. Knox and his men had to salvage it. They pressed on. By January 24, 1776, the first of the cannon arrived in Cambridge. By early March, nearly all were in position. The arrival of the artillery changed the strategic equation. Washington began planning to fortify Dorchester Heights, a hill south of Boston that overlooked the harbor. On the night of March 4th, 1776, colonial engineers and soldiers moved over 2,000 men and dozens of cannon onto the heights. They worked through the night, digging entrenchments and building fortifications. By dawn, the British looked up and saw a fully fortified position armed with heavy cannon. General Howe realized that his position in Boston was untenable. The British fleet in the harbor was now within range of colonial artillery. If the colonists opened fire, they could destroy the ships and bombard the city. On March 8th, British officials sent a message offering to spare the city if the colonists allowed them to evacuate unmolested. Washington agreed, but he insisted that the British leave the city intact. On March 17, 1776, the last British troops and Loyalist civilians boarded ships and sailed out of Boston Harbor. The evacuation was orderly. The British left behind some supplies and equipment. The colonial army marched into Boston. The siege was over, but the war was far from finished. The British regrouped in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They then launched a massive invasion of New York in the summer of 1776. The Continental Army suffered a series of defeats. Washington was driven out of New York, across New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. By December 1776, the army was on the verge of collapse. Yet Washington counterattacked on the night of December 25th, crossing the ice-choked Delaware River and defeating a Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory revived the revolutionary cause. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress had taken the decisive step. On July 4, 1776, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, proclaimed that the colonies were free and independent states. It listed the grievances against King George III, including the imposition of taxes without consent, the suspension of colonial legislatures, and the maintenance of standing armies in peacetime. The Declaration was not just a political statement. It was a formal act of rebellion. Signing it meant treason. The penalty was death. What systems failed in the period from the Boston Tea Party to the Declaration of Independence? The British system of imperial control failed because it could not adapt to the changing conditions in the colonies. The coercive acts were intended to isolate Massachusetts, but they united the colonies. The British military system failed because it underestimated the fighting ability of the militia. The intelligence system failed because it did not grasp the depth of colonial resistance. The political system failed because King George III and Lord North refused to compromise. They believed that concession would be interpreted as weakness. Instead, their intransigence hardened colonial resolve. The colonial system, by contrast, proved remarkably effective. The committees of correspondence allowed rapid communication. The Continental Congress provided a unified political body. The militia system, while decentralized, could mobilize thousands of men in hours. And the leadership of men like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson gave the Revolution a coherent direction. But the colonial system also had weaknesses. The army lacked discipline, supplies, and a permanent structure. The economy was strained. Inflated currency and shortages of goods created hardship. Loyalists, who may have numbered as many as 20% of the population, actively opposed the revolution. The war was not a simple conflict between a united colonial population and a distant empire. It was a civil war within the colonies. The human consequences of the Boston Tea Party and the war it helped start were enormous. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, an estimated 25,000 to 70,000 colonists had died from combat, disease, and imprisonment. Many more were wounded. Tens of thousands of Loyalists fled to Canada, Britain, and elsewhere, leaving behind homes and property. The Native American tribes, many of whom allied with the British, suffered devastating losses. The economic dislocation affected every level of society. Farms were destroyed, trade routes were cut, and debts accumulated. Yet out of this turmoil emerged a new nation with a republican form of government. Why does the Boston Tea Party still matter? It matters because it was a turning point in the history of self-government. The act of destroying the tea was illegal. It was vandalism, but it was also a deliberate political statement. The colonists were saying that they would not accept laws passed without their consent. That principle, that legitimate government requires the consent of the governed, is the foundation of the United States. The Tea Party is remembered not because of the tea that was dumped, but because of the idea that was asserted. It also matters because it illustrates the power of ordinary people to change the course of history. The men who disguised themselves as Mohawks and boarded the ships were not wealthy elites. They were working men. They risked their lives and livelihoods. They acted not out of personal gain, but out of a conviction that something larger than themselves was at stake. That spirit of civic engagement, of ordinary citizens taking responsibility for their government, is a continuing ideal. The Boston Tea Party is not a simple story of good versus evil. It raises questions about property rights, civil disobedience, and the limits of legitimate protest. But it remains a powerful symbol of resistance against tyranny. When people around the world protest unjust laws, they often invoke the memory of that December night in 1773. The tea is long gone. The harbor has changed, but the idea that citizens have a right to challenge authority when it becomes oppressive lives on. And that is why, more than 2 centuries later, we still talk about a ship, a cargo, and a group of men who decided that some things are worth fighting for. At 10 p.m. on the night of April 18, 1775, 700 British soldiers began crossing the Charles River from Boston to Cambridge. They moved in silence. Their orders were sealed. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, had received intelligence that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had hidden military supplies in Concord, 20 miles inland. Gage also believed that the rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying in Lexington, a small town along the route. He ordered the expedition to seize the supplies and arrest the men. The crossing took several hours. By midnight, the column had assembled on the Cambridge shore. They marched west along the road toward Lexington. The streets were dark. The soldiers carried heavy packs, muskets, and ammunition. Their officers knew the operation depended on secrecy. If the militia were warned, they would scatter and hide the supplies. But the British had not counted on the network of watchers that the colonists had established. In Boston, Dr. Joseph Warren had been monitoring British movements all evening. Around 10 p.m., he noticed unusual activity near the Common. He summoned Paul Revere and William Dawes. Revere was a silversmith and a courier for the Committee of Safety. Dawes was a tanner. Warren told them to ride to Lexington and warn Adams and Hancock, and then proceed to Concord to alert the militia. Revere left Boston by boat across the Charles River, rowing past the British warship HMS Somerset. Dawes slipped past the British guard on the Boston Neck. They took separate routes to reduce the risk of capture. Revere reached Lexington around midnight. He alerted Adams and Hancock. The two men prepared to flee. Revere then continued toward Concord. On the way, he was stopped by a British patrol and questioned. He managed to escape without his horse. Dawes also reached Lexington and continued toward Concord but turned back. The warning, however, had already spread. Church bells rang. Riders fanned out across the countryside. The message was simple: the regulars are coming. At dawn on April 19th, the British column arrived in Lexington. The town green was empty at first, but as the soldiers entered, a group of about 70 militiamen assembled on the green. They stood in ranks, muskets in hand. Their captain, John Parker, ordered them not to fire unless fired upon. The British officers ordered the militia to disperse. For a moment, both sides faced each other. Then a single shot rang out. No one knows who fired first. The British soldiers, acting on orders, discharged a volley. Then they charged with bayonets. 8 militiamen were killed, 10 were wounded, the rest scattered. The British marched on to Concord. In Concord, the militia had 3 hours to remove the supplies. They hid muskets, powder, and food in nearby fields and houses. When the British arrived in the town, they searched but found little. A contingent of soldiers was sent to the North Bridge. There, a growing number of militia had gathered. The British fired warning shots. The militia returned fire. This time, the colonists did not retreat. They advanced. The British soldiers, outnumbered and confused, fell back. The fight at the North Bridge marked the first time that colonial militia had engaged British regulars in open combat. By noon, the British column began its retreat back to Boston. They had failed to capture the supplies or the leaders, and the countryside was now alive with armed men. Militia companies from every town along the road converged on the British line. They took positions behind stone walls, trees, and houses. They fired from cover, then reloaded and fired again. The British soldiers marched down the narrow road, exposed on all sides. The officers had no clear plan for defense. Men fell, casualties mounted. The retreat became a nightmare. The column stretched for miles. The wounded were carried on carts. The soldiers were exhausted and low on ammunition. By late afternoon, they reached Lexington again, where reinforcements under Lord Percy met them. Percy deployed cannon to drive back the militia. The column formed a hollow square and continued its retreat. But the attacks did not stop. Militia from as far as Connecticut and New Hampshire had arrived. They sniped from every angle. The British did not reach the safety of the Charlestown Peninsula until dusk. That night they were ferried back across the river to Boston. When the initial reports were tallied, the British had suffered 273 casualties, 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The colonists lost 95 men, 49 dead, 41 wounded, and 5 missing. The numbers were not overwhelming, but the strategic impact was enormous. The British Army had been forced to retreat by an armed citizenry. The myth of British invincibility was shattered. The war was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. What happened in the immediate aftermath? Massachusetts began raising a full army. Militia companies from across New England converged on Boston. Within days, a ring of colonial troops surrounded the city. The siege of Boston had begun. The British were trapped on the peninsula. General Gage was cut off from the countryside. He had few supplies and no way to resupply his army except by sea. The Continental Congress in Philadelphia, still hoping for a peaceful resolution, tried one last appeal. They sent the olive branch petition to King George III, affirming loyalty and asking for a redress of grievances. The king refused to receive it. He declared the colonies in rebellion and ordered a blockade. On June 15, 1775, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army. Washington was a Virginian with experience in the French and Indian War. He had served as a delegate to the Congress. He accepted the command but admitted his own limitations. He wrote that he did not think himself equal to the task. He left Philadelphia for Boston. On July 3rd, he took formal command of the army at Cambridge. He found an army of about 17,000 men, mostly New England militia. They were poorly equipped, undisciplined, and short on supplies. Some had no muskets. Many had no tents. The army was not a professional force. It was a collection of farmers, tradesmen, and laborers who had left their homes and families to fight. Before Washington arrived, however, another battle had already been fought. On June 17th, the British decided to break the siege by seizing the heights on the Charlestown Peninsula. They landed troops at Moulton's Point. The colonial commanders William Prescott and Israel Putnam had fortified Breed's Hill, a smaller hill near Bunker Hill. At 3 p.m. the British infantry began its assault. They marched in perfect formation up the slope. The colonists held their fire until the British were within 50 yards. Then they unleashed a devastating volley. The British fell in rows. The line wavered and broke. The officers reformed them and attacked again. Again, the colonists fired and drove them back. By the third assault, the colonists had run out of ammunition. The British overran the redoubt. The defenders retreated. The British took the hill, but at a terrible price. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The colonists lost about 4-0. The battle, known as Bunker Hill, was a tactical British victory, but it was a strategic disaster. It demonstrated that the colonial militia could stand up to the best army in Europe. It also hardened the resolve on both sides. The siege of Boston continued through the summer and fall of 1775. Washington needed heavy artillery. He had no way to bombard the British positions or the fleet in the harbor. That was when Colonel Henry Knox proposed his plan. Knox was 25 years old, a bookseller from Boston who had taught himself military engineering. He convinced Washington to send him to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. In May 1775, a small force led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had captured the fort and its heavy guns. The cannons were still there. Knox would bring them to Boston. Knox left for Ticonderoga on November 17, 1775. He arrived on December 5th. He selected 59 pieces of artillery, cannons, mortars, and howitzers. The largest weighed over a ton. He had them loaded onto boats and crossed Lake George. Then the real work began. The guns were transferred to sledges. The weather in December was brutal. Snow fell in deep drifts. The roads were barely passable. Knox's team of men and oxen pulled the sledges across the frozen countryside. At one point, a cannon broke through the ice of a river. Knox directed the salvage effort. They dredged it out, dried it, and continued. The journey covered over 300 miles. On January 24, 1776, the first of the guns arrived in Cambridge. By early March, nearly all were in position. The arrival of the artillery changed the strategic equation. Washington began planning to fortify Dorchester Heights, a hill south of Boston that overlooked the harbor. On the night of March 4, 1776, colonial engineers and soldiers moved over 2,000 men and dozens of cannon onto the heights. They worked through the night, digging entrenchments and building fortifications. By dawn, the British looked up and saw a fully fortified position armed with heavy cannon. General William Howe, who had replaced Gage, realized that his position in Boston was untenable. The British fleet in the harbor was now within range of colonial artillery. If the colonists opened fire, they could destroy the ships and bombard the city. Howe faced a difficult choice. He could attack the heights, but that would likely be as costly as Bunker Hill. He could hold his position, but the fleet would be vulnerable. He chose to evacuate. On March 17, 1776, the last British troops and thousands of Loyalist civilians boarded ships and sailed out of Boston Harbor. The evacuation was orderly. The British left behind some supplies and equipment. The colonial army marched into Boston. The siege was over, but the war was far from finished. The British regrouped in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They then launched a massive invasion of New York in the summer of 1776. The Continental Army suffered a series of defeats. Washington was driven out of New York, across New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. By December 1776, the army was on the verge of collapse. Yet Washington counterattacked on the night of December 25th, crossing the ice-choked Delaware River and defeating a Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory revived the revolutionary cause. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress had taken the decisive step. On July 4, 1776, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, proclaimed that the colonies were free and independent states. It listed the grievances against King George III, including the imposition of taxes without consent, the suspension of colonial legislatures, and the maintenance of standing armies in peacetime. The Declaration was not just a political statement. It was a formal act of rebellion. Signing it meant treason. The penalty was death. Why does the Boston Tea Party still matter? It matters because it was the first direct, organized, and public act of defiance that forced an imperial power to respond. That response, the coercive acts, brought the colonies together. The war that followed was brutal and long. But the principle that the colonists asserted on that cold December night, that a people cannot be taxed or governed without their consent, remains a central idea of modern democracy. The Tea Party was not the cause of the war. It was the catalyst. It turned a decade of debate into a decision. And once the decision was made, there was no turning back. On December 16, 1773, at 6 p.m., the meeting at the Old South Meeting House had reached its conclusion. The crowd of over 5,000 had waited all day for word from Governor Thomas Hutchinson. He had refused to let the tea ships leave Boston Harbor without payment of the duty. The colonists had tried every legal avenue. They had petitioned. They had negotiated. They had posted guards to prevent the tea from being unloaded. And now the deadline had passed. The ships had been in the harbor for 20 days. Under British law, after 20 days, the customs officials could seize the cargo and land it by force. The colonists knew that if the tea was unloaded, it would be sold and the tax would be paid. That was unacceptable. At 6:15 p.m., Samuel Adams gave the signal. He stood at the front of the meeting and said, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." That was the agreed-upon code. In an instant, a group of men disguised as Mohawk warriors let out a war whoop and rushed toward the door. They headed for Griffin's Wharf. The crowd followed. The night was cold, the moon thin. About 100 men, possibly fewer, boarded the three ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. They worked quickly and methodically. They broke open the chests of tea, 340 chests total, weighing nearly 90,000 pounds. They dumped the contents into the harbor. The tea floated in the dark water, a dark stain spreading across the bay. By 9 p.m. it was over. The men dispersed into the night. No one was arrested. No one was identified. What happened next in London? The news did not reach England until late January once events eventful. The ship carrying the dispatches had encountered winter storms. When the report was finally delivered to Lord North's cabinet, the reaction was swift and severe. The British government saw the Tea Party not as a protest, but as an act of vandalism and rebellion. The destruction of private property. The tea belonged to the East India Company, was a direct challenge to the authority of Parliament. The question in Whitehall was not whether to punish Boston, but how harshly. Lord North proposed a series of punitive measures. The Parliament debated them through the spring. The King supported them. On March 31, 1774, the Boston Port Act was passed. It closed the port of Boston to all commerce until the East India Company was compensated for the destroyed tea. The act took effect on June 1, 1774. The effect was immediate. Boston was a port city. It lived by shipping. Now no ships could enter or leave. The wharves sat empty. Merchants lost their livelihoods. Workers lost their jobs. Food and fuel could not be brought in by sea. The town faced starvation. The British government had calculated that isolating Boston would break the colony's will, but the calculation missed something. The other colonies did not stand by. Committees of correspondence began sending aid. Food, money, and supplies poured into Boston from Massachusetts towns and from as far away as South Carolina. The punishment backfired. It united the colonies. That summer, Parliament passed 3 more acts. The Massachusetts Government Act altered the colony's charter. It nullified the elected assembly, gave the governor power to appoint all council members, and restricted town meetings. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than in Massachusetts, where juries might be sympathetic. The Quartering Act required colonies to provide housing for British soldiers. These 4 acts were called the Coercive Acts in Britain. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. In May 1774, General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in North America, arrived in Boston to replace Hutchinson as governor. Gage was a professional soldier. He had fought in the French and Indian War. He knew the colonies, but he underestimated the depth of the resistance. He believed that a show of force would restore order. He brought additional regiments. By the summer of 1774, Boston was an occupied city. British soldiers patrolled the streets. The colonists resented their presence. Friction grew. On September 1, 1774, Gage ordered the seizure of gunpowder stored in a powder house in Charlestown. The action triggered a false alarm, the powder alarm that spread throughout New England. Thousands of militia began to march, thinking war had started. The misunderstanding was corrected, but the fear was real. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774. All 13 colonies except Georgia sent delegates. They debated how to respond. Some wanted reconciliation. Others wanted resistance. They agreed on a declaration of rights and grievances. They endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, which called for economic sanctions and military preparedness. They also formed the Continental Association, a system of non-importation and non-exportation agreements designed to pressure Britain. The Congress adjourned in late October, agreeing to reconvene in May 1775 if their demands were not met. That winter, the situation in Massachusetts worsened. Gage received orders to enforce the coercive acts. He began fortifying Boston Neck, the only land connection between Boston and the mainland. He sent expeditions to seize colonial military supplies. In February 1775, Gage decided to move against the militia arsenals at Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. He planned a secret night march, but the colonists had spies. Paul Revere and other writers were ready. On the night of April 18, 1775, at 10 p.m., Revere received word that the British regulars were crossing the Charles River. He mounted a horse and rode toward Lexington. He arrived at 12:30 a.m. and warned the town. The militia assembled on the village green. At dawn on April 19, 1775, the British column arrived in Lexington. About 700 regulars under the command of Major John Pitcairn faced a small militia company of about 70 men. Pitcairn ordered the militia to disperse. They hesitated. Then a shot was fired, the famous shot heard round the world. No one knows who fired first, but the British responded with a volley. 8 colonists were killed. The militia scattered. The British continued toward Concord. At Concord, the militia had removed most of the supplies. The British searched the town. At the North Bridge, a confrontation occurred. The militia, now numbering several hundred, advanced. The British fired first, but the colonists returned fire. 3 British soldiers and 2 colonists fell. The British column turned back. The march to Boston became a running battle. Militia from every town along the road ambushed the British. They fired from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The British soldiers were exhausted and low on ammunition. By the time they reached Boston, they had lost 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The colonists lost 49 dead, 41 wounded, and 5 missing. The war was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. What happened in the immediate aftermath? Massachusetts began raising a full army. Militia companies from across New England converged on Boston. Within days, a ring of colonial troops surrounded the city. The siege of Boston had begun. The British were trapped on the peninsula. General Gage was cut off from the countryside. He had few supplies and no way to resupply his army except by sea. The Continental Congress in Philadelphia, still hoping for a peaceful resolution, tried one last appeal. They sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, affirming loyalty and asking for a redress of grievances. The king refused to receive it. He declared the colonies in rebellion and ordered a blockade. On June 15, 1775, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army. Washington was a Virginian with experience in the French and Indian War. He had served as a delegate to the Congress. He accepted the command, but admitted his own limitations. He wrote that he did not think himself equal to the task. He left Philadelphia for Boston. On July 3rd, he took formal command of the army at Cambridge. He found an army of about 17,000 men, mostly New England militia. They were poorly equipped, undisciplined, and short on supplies. Some had no muskets. Many had no tents. The army was not a professional force. It was a collection of farmers, tradesmen, and laborers who had left their homes and families to fight. Before Washington arrived, however, another battle had already been fought. On June 17th, the British decided to break the siege by seizing the heights on the Charlestown Peninsula. They landed troops at Moulton's Point. The colonial commanders, William Prescott and Israel Putnam, had fortified Breed's Hill, a smaller hill near Bunker Hill. At 3 p.m., the British infantry began its assault. They marched in perfect formation up the slope. The colonists held their fire until the British were within 50 yards. Then they unleashed a devastating volley. The British fell in rows. The line wavered and broke. The officers reformed them and attacked again. Again, the colonists fired and drove them back. By the third assault, the colonists had run out of ammunition. The British overran the redoubt. The defenders retreated. The British took the hill, but at a terrible price. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The colonists lost about 4-0. The battle, known as Bunker Hill, was a tactical British victory, but it was a strategic disaster. It demonstrated that the colonial militia could stand up to the best army in Europe. It also hardened the resolve on both sides. The siege of Boston continued through the summer and fall of 1775. Washington needed heavy artillery. He had no way to bombard the British positions or the fleet in the harbor. That was when Colonel Henry Knox proposed his plan. Knox was 25 years old, a bookseller from Boston who had taught himself military engineering. He convinced Washington to send him to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. In May 1775, a small force led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had captured the fort and its heavy guns. The cannons were still there. Knox would bring them to Boston. Knox left for Ticonderoga on November 17, 1775. He arrived on December 5th. He selected 59 pieces of artillery, cannons, mortars, and howitzers. The largest weighed over a ton. He had them loaded onto boats and crossed Lake George. Then the real work began. The guns were transferred to sledges. The weather in December was brutal. Snow fell in deep drifts. The roads were barely passable. Knox's team of men and oxen pulled the sledges across the frozen countryside. At one point, a cannon broke through the ice of a river. Knox directed the salvage effort. They dredged it out, dried it, and continued. The journey covered over 300 miles. On January 24, 1776, the first of the guns arrived in Cambridge. By early March, nearly all were in position. The arrival of the artillery changed the strategic equation. Washington began planning to fortify Dorchester Heights, a hill south of Boston that overlooked the harbor. On the night of March 4th, 1776, colonial engineers and soldiers moved over 2,000 men and dozens of cannon onto the heights. They worked through the night, digging entrenchments and building fortifications. By dawn, the British looked up and saw a fully fortified position armed with heavy cannon. General William Howe, who had replaced Gage, realized that his position in Boston was untenable. The British fleet in the harbor was now within range of colonial artillery. If the colonists opened fire, they could destroy the ships and bombard the city. Howe faced a difficult choice. He could attack the heights, but that would likely be as costly as Bunker Hill. He could hold his position, but the fleet would be vulnerable. He chose to evacuate. On March 17, 1776, the last British troops and thousands of Loyalist civilians boarded ships and sailed out of Boston Harbor. The evacuation was orderly. The British left behind some supplies and equipment. The colonial army marched into Boston. The siege was over, but the war was far from finished. The British regrouped in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They then launched a massive invasion of New York in the summer of 1776. The Continental Army suffered a series of defeats. Washington was driven out of New York, across New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. By December 1776, the army was on the verge of collapse. Yet Washington counterattacked on the night of December 25th, crossing the ice-choked Delaware River and defeating a Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory revived the Revolutionary cause. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress had taken the decisive step. On July 4, 1776, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, proclaimed that the colonies were free and independent states. It listed the grievances against King George III, including the imposition of taxes without consent, the suspension of colonial legislatures, and the maintenance of standing armies in peacetime. The Declaration was not just a political statement. It was a formal act of rebellion. Signing it meant treason. The penalty was death. Why does the Boston Tea Party still matter? It matters because it was the first direct, organized, and public act of defiance that forced an imperial power to respond. That response, the coercive acts, brought the colonies together. The war that followed was brutal and long. But the principle that the colonists asserted on that cold December night, that a people cannot be taxed or governed without their consent, remains a central idea of modern democracy. The Tea Party was not the cause of the war. It was the catalyst. It turned a decade of debate into a decision. And once the decision was made, there was no turning back. But consider the British perspective. At 10 a.m. on January 29, 1774, the first ship carrying news of the Tea Party arrived in London. The captain was brought before the Board of Trade. Within hours, the details circulated through Parliament. The East India Company, already near bankruptcy, faced a loss of nearly £10,000 sterling. The government saw the destruction as an attack on property rights and imperial authority. Lord North convened the cabinet. The debate centered on how to isolate the radicals in Boston without alienating the other colonies. They believed that the Massachusetts Government Act would dismantle the rebel infrastructure. They believed that closing the port would starve the town into submission. They misjudged the solidarity of the other colonies. The question they failed to ask was, would punishment unite or divide? One factor that the British underestimated was the committees of correspondence. These networks had been established in 1772 by Samuel Adams. They connected towns across Massachusetts and eventually all the colonies. When the Boston Port Act was published, the committees sprang into action. They circulated letters, organized relief, and called for a Continental Congress. The speed of communication surprised the British. Within weeks, shipments of rice from South Carolina and flour from Pennsylvania reached Boston. The boycott of British goods, organized through the Continental Association, began to hurt British merchants. By late 1774, petitions from British manufacturers flooded Parliament pleading for reconciliation. Lord North ignored them. Another overlooked detail, the role of the tea consignees. These were the men appointed by the East India Company to receive the tea. In Boston, the consignees included the sons of Governor Hutchinson. They were seen as collaborators. When the tea ships arrived, the colonists demanded the consignees resign. They refused. That refusal forced the standoff. The consignees were protected by the British military, but their property was threatened. On the night of the Tea Party, some of their warehouses were guarded, but the attack was aimed only at the tea. The consignees later fled Boston. One of Hutchinson's sons, Thomas Jr., sailed for England. He never returned. The personal cost of the crisis was real. The British also failed to recognize the shifting opinion in the countryside. The coercive acts were designed to punish Massachusetts, but they alarmed farmers and tradesmen in every colony. The idea that Parliament could unilaterally alter a colony's charter threatened the political autonomy of each colony. The Massachusetts Government Act was particularly inflammatory. It banned town meetings without the governor's permission. Town meetings were the backbone of New England local government. Farmers who had never supported the radical Sons of Liberty now saw their rights being stripped. Military preparations began across New England. By the spring of 1775, the militia had secretly stockpiled weapons and powder. Gage's spies reported the activity, but he could not stop it. One specific location was Concord, where the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had stored cannon, musket balls, and flour. Gage knew about the depot. He planned to seize it on April 19th. But he kept the plan secret even from his own officers until the last moment. The secrecy was meant to prevent leaks. It also prevented coordination. The British column marched at night, but the sound of boats crossing the river and the ringing of church bells alerted the countryside. The British were observed at every step. The result was the disaster of the retreat. The significance of the Boston Tea Party, then, is not only in what it accomplished in one 1773. It set in motion a chain of cause and effect that no one fully controlled. The British overreacted. The colonists organized. The war came. The Tea Party itself was not a battle. It was a symbolic act, a destruction of property to make a political point. But it was the point that mattered. It defined the stakes: taxation without representation, rule of law, and the right of a people to govern themselves. Those ideas outlasted the tea leaves that floated in Boston Harbor. But the immediate aftermath of the Tea Party was not measured in ideas alone. At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of March 25, 1774, the British Parliament began debate on what would become the Boston Port Act. The bill passed without a division. King George III gave his assent on March 31st. The act declared that the port of Boston was closed to all shipping until the East India Company was compensated for its lost tea. The customs house was moved to Salem. The seat of government for Massachusetts was moved to Salem as well. Royal officials and soldiers were to be tried in other colonies or in Britain, not in Massachusetts, if they were charged with crimes while enforcing the laws. This was the first of 4 coercive acts, which the colonists would call the Intolerable Acts. What happened next? Within weeks, news of the Port Act reached the other colonies. The committees of correspondence which Samuel Adams had begun building in 1772 now became the backbone of a coordinated response. On May 13, 1774, the Boston Committee sent a circular letter to every other committee in the colonies, calling for a Congress. The letter asked each colony to send delegates to Philadelphia. The date was set for September 1st. The purpose was to consider a united response to the British measures. The response was swift. Virginia's House of Burgesses declared June 1st, the day the Port Act took effect, as a day of fasting and prayer. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, dissolved the assembly. The Burgesses moved to a nearby tavern and continued meeting. They selected delegates for the Philadelphia Congress. Other colonies followed, but the British government did not stop with the Port Act. On May 20th, 1774, Parliament passed the Massachusetts Government Act. This act altered the colony's charter. The governor could now appoint all judges, sheriffs, and magistrates. Town meetings were forbidden without the governor's permission. The act also allowed the governor to choose juries, eliminating the traditional method of selection by town selectmen. The colonists saw this as an attack on their fundamental rights. The power of local government was stripped away. On the same day, Parliament passed the Administration of Justice Act. This act allowed royal officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried in another colony or in England. The colonists called it the Murder Act because they believed it would allow British soldiers to kill with impunity. It was a direct response to the Boston Massacre trials, where the soldiers had been defended by John Adams and acquitted. The British wanted to ensure that future trials would not be influenced by local juries. The fourth act was the Quartering Act of 1774, which applied to all colonies. It allowed British troops to be quartered in occupied buildings if barracks were not available. This replaced an earlier act that required troops to be billeted only in inns and unoccupied houses. The colonists saw it as an invasion of their homes. The British also added the Quebec Act in June 1774, which extended the boundaries of Quebec into the Ohio Valley and granted the Catholic Church official recognition. To the colonists, especially the Protestant majority, this was another provocation. It blocked their westward expansion and seemed to favor Catholicism. The combination of the five acts was meant to isolate Massachusetts and restore order. Instead, it brought the colonies closer together. Consider the scene in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774. 56 delegates from 12 colonies. Georgia sent no delegates, gathered at Carpenter's Hall. They included George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Jay, and Richard Henry Lee. The delegates were not yet calling for independence. Most wanted to negotiate a restoration of rights under British law. But they agreed on one thing: the coercive acts must be repealed. They drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which listed the acts of Parliament that violated colonial liberties. They also created the Continental Association, a system of non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption of British goods. The association was enforced by local committees. Violators were publicly shamed. Their names were printed in newspapers. Some were tarred and feathered. The First Continental Congress adjourned on October 26, 1774, agreeing to reconvene in May 1775 if their grievances were not addressed. They sent a petition to the king, the Olive Branch Petition, expressing loyalty but demanding repeal. The petition was ignored. King George III refused to receive it. Instead, he declared the colonies in a state of rebellion. Parliament passed the Restraining Act, which prohibited the New England colonies from trading with any country except Britain and the British West Indies. The act also banned them from fishing in the North Atlantic. The colonies saw this as economic warfare. By November 1774, the situation in Massachusetts had reached a tipping point. Governor Thomas Gage, who had been appointed military governor, received orders to enforce the coercive acts. He attempted to do so, but when he tried to appoint magistrates under the new Massachusetts Government Act, the towns refused to cooperate. The courts were closed. Juries were not impaneled. The colonial government had effectively ceased to function. In response, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, an extra-legal body, met in Concord on October 7, 1774. They appointed John Hancock as president and began organizing the militia. They designated certain members as Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice. They also began stockpiling arms and powder. The British intelligence network detected these activities, but Gage was reluctant to act decisively. He wrote to London asking for more troops. By early 1775, he had about 4,000 soldiers in Boston, a city of 16,000. The town was under military occupation. Now step back and consider a specific detail. On September 1st, 1774, British soldiers seized gunpowder from the magazine at Charlestown. The powder belonged to the colonial government. The secretary of the province, Thomas Flucker, later wrote that the seizure was meant to prevent the powder from falling into rebel hands. The soldiers removed the powder in the dead of night and transported it to Castle William in Boston Harbor. When word spread the next morning, thousands of colonists mobilized. Militia companies from surrounding towns marched toward Boston. They believed the British were about to attack. The rumor was false, but the mobilization showed the depth of anger. Gage saw the reaction and realized the danger. He began fortifying Boston Neck, the narrow strip of land connecting the town to the mainland. The colonists watched. Tension grew. How could this have escalated so quickly? The British government had assumed that a show of force would quell the rebellion. Instead, it fueled it. The closing of the port hurt Boston merchants, but relief shipments from other colonies kept the town alive. The Massachusetts Government Act removed the authority of town meetings, but the town simply met anyway in defiance. The Quartering Act allowed troops in private homes, but the colonists refused to provide quarters. Gage was forced to house his troops in tents on Boston Common during the winter of 1774, 1775. The soldiers suffered. Desertions increased. By the spring of 1775, both sides were preparing for war. On April 14th, Gage received orders from London to take decisive action. His orders were to suppress the rebellion and arrest the leaders. Specifically, he was to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying in Lexington. He was also to destroy the military stores in Concord. Gage planned the operation in secret. He chose his best troops, the light infantry and grenadiers of the Boston garrison. On the night of April 18th, the soldiers were roused from their beds. They marched to the Boston waterfront. Boats ferried them across the Charles River to Cambridge. From there, they began the march to Concord. The Colonial Intelligence Network, led by Paul Revere and Dr. Joseph Warren, detected the movement. William Dawes and Paul Revere rode out to warn the countryside. In Lexington, Samuel Adams and John Hancock escaped. The militia assembled on the green. At dawn, the British column arrived. A confrontation occurred. A shot was fired. The colonists scattered. 8 men lay dead. The British continued to Concord. They destroyed some supplies, but most had been moved. On their return march, they were attacked by militia from every town along the road. The British suffered heavy casualties. By nightfall, the survivors staggered back into Boston. The war had begun. The Boston Tea Party, then, was the first domino in a cascade. It set in motion the passage of the coercive acts, which unified the colonies. It led to the formation of the Continental Congress and the Continental Association. It forced the British to escalate their military response, and it created the conditions for the armed resistance of April 19th. The Tea Party itself did not cause the war, but without it there might have been no universal colonial outrage, no Congress, no association. The British response might have remained piecemeal. The radicals might have been isolated, but they were not. Consider the human cost. The men who dumped the tea risked their lives and fortunes. Many of them served in the war that followed. Joseph Warren, who led the Sons of Liberty in Boston after the Tea Party, was killed at Bunker Hill. John Hancock became president of the Continental Congress and later governor of Massachusetts. Samuel Adams continued as a firebrand. He served in the Congress and later as lieutenant governor. Some participants died in obscurity. Some were captured. One account records that a participant named George Hughes, who had helped dump the tea, was later captured by the British. He was held in a prison ship for months. He survived. He lived to be 98 years old, the last survivor of the Tea Party. He told his story to a writer in the 1A3's rows. His memory was vivid. He described the night. The sound of axes splitting chests, the splash of tea hitting the water, the voices of men speaking in low tones. The legacy of that night is still debated. Some historians argue that the Tea Party was an act of vandalism against private property. Others see it as a legitimate expression of political protest. Both views have merit. But what cannot be disputed is that the colonists had exhausted legal remedies. They had petitioned the king. They had boycotted. They had held congresses. Nothing worked. In the end, they chose direct action. That choice had consequences. It also had a logic. When a government refuses to hear the complaints of its people, the people eventually find other ways to be heard. The Boston Tea Party remains a symbol of that principle. It is taught in schools as a founding moment of American identity. But it is also a cautionary tale about escalation. The British did not understand the depth of colonial anger. They believed that punishment would restore order. It did the opposite. The colonists saw the coercive acts as confirmation that the British government was tyrannical. They prepared for war. The Tea Party was the point of no return. And so, on December 16, 1773, about 300 men dressed as Mohawks, their faces darkened with soot, walked through the streets of Boston. They carried axes and lanterns. The moon was nearly full. They boarded 3 ships. They worked for 3 hours. They dumped 340 chests of tea into the harbor. The tea was worth about £10,000 sterling. That money was never repaid. The British government did not win back the loyalty of the colonists. The East India Company did not recover its losses. The townspeople of Boston did not starve. They found other ways. The story does not end in 1776. It continues for 7 more years of war, with all the suffering that war brings. But the night of the Tea Party is the moment when the colonists chose to act. They did not know if they would succeed. They did not know if they would be hanged. They acted anyway. That fact, more than any other, is why the Boston Tea Party still matters. It is not just about tea. It is about the willingness of ordinary people to risk everything for an idea. And ideas, once released, cannot be recalled.